Lady Link. Matt Weston.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It's a year ago that we sat in a packed chamber to hear the Chancellor claim he was, and I quote, releasing the counter-cyclical buffer. I have to say that at the time I thought it was something to do with letting his neighbour out of his fridge. In fact, none of us are still any the wiser. More seriously, by that day, the Prime Minister had already chosen to miss the first 5 Cobra briefings on the epidemic. He had indeed gone AWOL. It was a time when we should have been hearing the drumbeat of a government preparing to face the threat. What we heard instead was this, and I quote, "We will protect our country and our people," except it didn't. 123,000 deaths and counting, an economy that has crashed, falling 10% last year, with the government presiding over the worst death rate of all major nations. They got it wrong. And now we face the worst economic damage of all large economies, the consequences of which will be suffered for decades to come. They got it wrong. Having sat and listened to the Chancellor's speech, it seems extraordinary that he did not mention once the need for greater investment in our health service. Nor did he choose to acknowledge the work of all those on the front line, including social care workers, and repay them for the courage and professionalism. Sadly, he has chosen not to respect their efforts. One thing we've learned from this past year is that the government does well to listen to this opposition. For example, the suggestion to introduce a furlough scheme, and I welcome the government's announcement that it will be extending this for a further 6 months. But it should have done this from day one, as in Germany. Theirs runs until early 2022. The truth is that the Chancellor's announcement today does little to address the foundations of our economy, foundations undermined by the austerity of the past 10 years, not just for our economy, but in terms of our social fabric and the increasing inequality, laid bare by the pandemic. But not once did he mention inequality. Mr. Deputy Speaker, you can measure a government by its priorities. Whilst the Chancellor talked up his free ports, it all sounded a bit Emperor's new clothes. And a government that continues with HS2, despite the fundamental restructuring of our economy that's going on, and yet unable to recognise that a council house building programme is so desperately needed. And when it comes to our businesses, all their leaders wanted to hear was some certainty in a country that has been bedevilled by the policies of successive Conservative governments, resulting in a steep decline in business investment. He's got it wrong. Where is the vision and delivery of public-private investment? Where were the plans for a network of EV charging points, of hydrogen infrastructure, if we are to deliver net zero? It is not enough to leave it to the private sector, as they themselves state. And finally, it is not enough to continue with a business rates holiday. The Chancellor failed to do the right thing and undertake the wholesale revision needed to address the massive distortion in our economic landscape. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the evidence is damning. The OBR has underlined this, the worst economic damage of any G7 country, and it will be the public that pays for the Chancellor's mistakes. A word of advice then for the Chancellor. He needs to start acting in the national interest and not as in his self-interest. The public will never forgive him. Once again, he's got it wrong. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker.